we've had a real focus on developing our young leaders. So the kind of the next generation that's entering the banking business, and we've done that through a mentorship program which we started last year, and then having targeted programs for our young leaders. So that's what we're aiming to achieve here in Boston. We couldn't achieve that mission without our two local sponsors, Goulston and Storrs, and new banks. So I want to just give a special thank you to Jim Lerner and to Obadiah Dart for their continued support of our local chapter, because we wouldn't be able to thrive without your support. So today's program, I'm excited about it. It's very topical, returning, to the office. What does that mean from the employment perspective, which is what Josh will bring to the table, and then from the landlord perspective, which is what James McGaldy will bring to the table. And I know that it's top of mind for many of us whose firms are thinking about return to the office. How do they go about doing that? Certainly for dual income households, having two folks that are working from home, and the challenges that we're going to face with the school system is part of that as well. So our panel discussion is going to be moderated by Jim Lerner today, which I appreciate. Many of you on the WebEx here, I'm sure know Jim. He's a director at Goulston and Storrs, and he co-chairs the capital markets and debt group at Goulston. Splits his time between Boston and New York. Jim, he's got a lot of experience working on multi-lender, transactions, construction loans, REIT facilities, acquisition loans, structured finance, and also workouts. In terms of our panelists, we have James McGaldy from Boston Properties, and then Josh Davis, also of Goulston and Storrs. James serves as a senior vice president at Boston Properties. He's responsible for, capital markets, which includes the debt financing. So many of you on the phone that cover Boston Properties have a long history and familiarity with James. In addition to raising debt for the firm, James interfaces with the rating agencies, the Treasury group, and then joint ventures and tenant credit underwriting. So we welcome James to the program, and he's got a pretty deep banking background as well. So very familiar with what all of us do on the line as balance sheet lenders. And finally, last but not least, Josh Davis is a employment attorney, lawyer, and litigator at Goulston and Storrs. He's a director, counsels companies, facing, HR challenges and various, business disputes. I'm sure spending a lot of his time today on COVID and return to work, and what employers can and cannot do. His clients include public and private companies, hospitals, law firms, media companies, automobile dealerships, financial services firms, etc. So Josh, thank you very much for taking the time. I think it's going to be a great perspective from the employer side as well, and not just the landlord. So with those introductions, Jim, I'll turn it over to you to kick it off.
Great. Thanks, John, and thank you to RELA for the opportunity to discuss this important topic. When we all left our offices in March, we left an office imagined around open spaces, collaboration, and less square footage per employee. Many offices had just been reconstructed to force people closer. Now, 5 months later, there's a new phrase, social distancing, which has come into play, and that dominates our discussion. As we debate our return to offices, whether it be on a limited basis now in certain jurisdictions, or as everybody's been pointing to, after Labor Day, which is now 30 days away, it's a question of, how do we get it done, and what will the offices look like, and how do we get people comfortable to return? We realize this webinar is being offered, chapter-wise throughout the country. So we're going to not just focus just on Boston, but also what we've learned nationally. And in that sense, we have two great speakers who deal on a national basis as well. Different states have different challenges these days. If you see the map every night, the hot spots seem to be growing and almost seem to be encircling the Northeast again, which was one of the original hotspot areas. So the question is, how do we work, work it out to get people comfortable with coming back and getting employers and employees, on the same page. And also we also have to realize that we're part of a bigger system, that all our local economies, really depend upon the office worker returning, so those businesses can come back and do what they do as part of the process. So, that's what we hope to discuss today. And, we'll start it off with James. And what is Boston Properties doing, trying to sort of reimagine the new office?
Thanks for the introduction, John, and thanks for having me as part of the panel today. Happy to share my thoughts and the company's thoughts on what we've been doing to get really not only our employees but our tenants comfortable with the repopulation of our office buildings. I'm sitting at my desk today, as I've been doing on many days throughout the week since June 1st, when we had an opt-in policy that we implemented to get our people back into the office and back into a more traditional environment, if you will, in terms of conducting our business. It is a new experience for those who have not done it, and it will be a bit of an adjustment. We as a company put together a health and safety task force that was headed by Ben Myers, who heads up the sustainability efforts for Boston Properties. And they, along with many industry experts, both in real estate, some are partners, quite frankly, several of which are overseas partners who were dealing with this pandemic in their own countries prior to it becoming a real issue in the United States, and some in the medical community as advisors as to how we could implement certain protocols and strategies, obviously following first and foremost the federal, state, and local guidelines in terms of what we can and can't do in terms of repopulating, and then adhering to the CDC guidelines regarding hygiene, cleanliness, navigation, and elevators. So we implemented, and it's been an evolution. The process has changed over time as technologies have become more available. For example, the first repopulation occurred in Boston, as I mentioned, on June 1st, and it included, temperature screening that was handheld with a medical professional in the lobbies, along with signage that helped you navigate through lobbies and restricted the number of individuals that could be on elevators. Every employee of this company was given a PPE package, if you will, that included hand sanitizer and desk blotters and masks, and we're all required to wear those things in the office and stay socially distant within the office environment. So we've been doing a lot of things to get ourselves, first our employee base, and second our tenants, comfortable with the navigation process from home into the office and then back home again, so that we can feel comfortable and safe in the environment that has COVID as the backdrop. And again, we've done a number of things. That the screening process really starts at the beginning of the day at home, where you're registering on an application and certifying to your health and symptoms and temperature and things like that before you even get into your car or utilize public transportation, which is probably unlikely at this point, to navigate into the office. And then once you get here, you're thermal scanned, you're wearing a mask, and you navigate into your office. And if you're fortunate enough to have an office where you can close a door, maybe not wearing a mask in your office space, but that's the benefit, I guess, of having an office, and maybe that'll be a trend in terms of office space utilization going forward. We'll have to wait and see. But the experience is very different. There's signage everywhere. There's arrows on the floor. You have to navigate in a manner around, you know, the following the signage that will help you navigate not only to places like the kitchen, but to the bathroom, to the exits, to the elevator, to other people's offices. So it's definitely a new normal. I think it takes a little bit getting used to, but once you get used to it, it's something that, you know, I think is here to stay, at least until science catches up and there is a vaccine that gets us all comfortable with a normal state that we're all looking much more forward to than the adjusted state that we're in right now. So those are the things that the company is doing to get our employee base comfortable and get our tenants comfortable. We have to adhere to the state's guidelines regarding occupancy, and the limitation in the city of Boston specifically is now 50%. We are nowhere near that, quite frankly, across the entire portfolio in terms of our buildings. That would include the regions that we are also allowed to occupy office space, which would be New York and Washington, D.C. And we are, I would suggest, under 10% across the portfolio nationally. California is a little different. They have policies and protocols regarding going to the beach, but they don't have policies and protocols necessarily regarding getting into office buildings. So that's their priority. Hopefully we catch up in California and Los Angeles, San Francisco specifically in the near term. But that's really what we've been doing, summarizing what the company has been doing as a landlord for its employees and for its tenants to get to a point where we can repopulate and stay safe and adhere to the protocols that we're all required to adhere to, whether it's the CDC, the state, or the federal government.
Okay. Are you doing anything with air systems at all? Or
We're doing a number of things with the infrastructure itself. We've increased the amount of circulation within our buildings to a turn level, a turn frequency that is a multiple of what it was prior to COVID. And we are, as a result, running buildings at a higher and less green, or in a less green manner, because we're utilizing more power to turn the HVAC as frequently as we are. So I think and we've got increased janitorial service in terms of disinfecting, all the surfaces, and we've got increased security, and we've had to implement, the technology that I mentioned regarding thermal screening, but we've also made modifications to elevator systems to provide, at least in the Prudential Tower specifically as a good example, was formerly a old school elevator system where you touch the button and pick your floor. Now it's all touchless and card activated. So things to remove the hard surface contact that we've been, had experienced pre-COVID, and we're trying to do what we can. Many of our buildings have modern elevator systems that don't require that sort of retrofitting, but there has certainly been an expense due to COVID as it relates to the infrastructure and the operating of our buildings.
So are you doing temperature checks in the lobby? Is that a requirement?
We are. It's actually the same for those, it was national news, but for those that are familiar with Boston and the unfortunate Boston Marathon bombings and the equipment that was utilized to locate Tsarnaev in the boat in Watertown is the same company and basically the same thermal screening technology that has been purchased by this company and has been implemented in many of our lobbies, specifically in Boston, but across the portfolio to do thermal scanning. So you basically stand in front of an imager. There's no handheld device, and it can be operated by a security guard. And if you have a temperature of 100 or less, you pass. If it's above 100, then you get 5 minutes to cool down, and if you don't cool down, you're not allowed admittance to the building.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, you said you've had about 10%, you think, return. And Does it vary between your suburban locations and
Not
your
really,
urban
Jim. I
locations?
think that the real benefit of the suburban location is just, and you would think that there would be, just because more of the commuter for a suburban location is not using public transportation.
Right.
But I don't think that we've really seen a distinction at this point in terms of occupancy levels, urban versus suburban.
Okay. Josh, I know you're certainly involved with our return to the office and going through a lot of the issues. And what are you seeing as far as some of the ideas that James has had and some of the concerns that
Yeah,
our
so
clients are seeing?
a couple different thoughts. The first is that the idea, the things that James outlined in terms of what's happening in Boston Properties offices are really consistent with the kinds of advice that I've been giving people about returning to work. What I wanted to do, though, is just sort of step back and look a little bit at the why, and also at some thoughts about how to figure out how to get people to be productive. Because when working with employers, my principal goal is to help them make their workplaces efficient, which right now may or may not include going back to work. Right? In most of the cities, governmental guidance remains people should work from home if they can. So a lot of clients are pressing to try to make this bizarre Zoom environment where we've all become television characters as opposed to real people, an efficient way to work. And in some businesses it works, in some places it doesn't. But once you talk about bringing people back into buildings, I think there's that employers operate from a basic obligation of creating a safe space. There's a lot of legislative effort to try to figure out how to create effectively protections against COVID-based claims against landlords, against employers, against anybody who may create an environment in which there's transmission. And the litigator part of me hangs on to, even if that doesn't happen, proving where you got this disease, given how widespread it is in the world, is going to be a complicated road for anyone who wants to bring a claim like this. But here's the thing, we've learned, I mean, who knows what we've really learned, but one thing I think we can collectively agree on is that this thing spreads fast, and it spreads most easily indoors, and it spreads in communities of people. So what's the primary way in which you can structure if you're talking about people coming back to work, how do you think about having a workplace function? Well, you need everyone who's part of a work community to change a little bit the way they think about work. So my guess is almost everyone on this call has spent their whole professional life thinking that if they can drag their sorry self into the office to work, no matter how bad they're feeling, it's better to go in than it is to stay out. We regard that as a demonstration of commitment to the people we work with. We regard that as a kind of statement of who we are and what our priorities are. And for most of us, it served to make us perhaps more successful than we would be if we had erred in terms of staying out. Every single workplace needs every single employee to change the way they think about that equation. If you don't feel well at all, you need, as a person and as an employer, you need the employee who doesn't feel well at all to exempt themselves from work. So the first principle, and the temperature checks are part of this, but this is more broad, is each employer needs to have a screening apparatus in place. And it really is a self-screen. An employee may be, I'm advising folks to create questionnaires. Questionnaires have a series of questions. Have you been exposed? Do you feel unwell at all? Because you don't want somebody who thinks they have a stuffy nose from allergies to decide, well, I always have allergies, so I'm going anyway. Or they think they have a cough that's bronchitis, to go in anyway. What you want is people to be sitting with the two things of hand sanitizer that James has behind them if they come in feeling totally well and being paranoid about keeping their distance and safety. So screening is number one, and that's the changed environment. The second thing is hygiene, right? We're all told that if we keep our hands clean and we don't touch our faces, we're more likely to stay well. So you've got to keep your hands clean. You also need to maintain distance. And this is where workspaces start to get weird, right? James is talking about arrows on floors. Employers need to think about occupancy limits in bathrooms and how you make that work. At Goulston and Storrs, we now have one person per bathroom. And we have a little occupied, unoccupied sign that sadly is the responsibility of the person who last used the bathroom to change. And it turns out that people are not necessarily good at changing the sign from occupied to unoccupied, which can create a lot of discomfort if people don't test the proposition. But the point is that you're making these changes.
That was diplomatic.
Yeah.
That's just, well, you know, I thought about going in a different direction, and then I realized that it's not just the people I can see on the screen, but there are other people who are the victim, who are forced to listen to what I'm saying. So you change those things. You change food distribution. You change thoughts about whether people can have outside people come into meetings. And then you need people to wear face coverings. So most clients I have a number of clients who are conference room heavy in the way they work, because you know, the way people sometimes generate ideas is we sit near each other, and they're just making decisions to close conference rooms and to push people who are in the office. So let's say James and I and Jim, we're all in the same space and we're going to have a meeting. We can either have that meeting at a distance wearing masks, not being able to see each other's faces, or we can do it by Zoom from the office. And a lot of folks are moving towards Zoom from the office. And then you wonder, is that worth it or is that not worth it? So all of this is a lot of words for trying to help. I'm working to try to help employers reimagine how they can use their space. Employers who can function effectively not at work are trying to figure out how to create work that doesn't involve going in. That's why the occupancy limits look the way James's does. And then there's a category of employers who need people to be present because it's retail sales. Or it's, I mean, when we get to the fall, it could be education. And then they've got different questions. So there's clear government guidance on this question. Let's say I'm told by my employer I need to come in, and I'm in a vulnerable age population. Can I say to the employer, I'm not interested in coming to work because of my age, and would I be protected? Federal government says no. But if you have a protected, if you're vulnerable because you have an underlying disability, then you may well be protected against coming to work. So employers are now trying to navigate a whole host of new issues. Last one, and then I'll stop. These quarantine orders, just extended in Massachusetts to Rhode Island, create a very interesting dynamic between what employers can and can't do vis-a-vis their employees and what they're faced with. So let's say I'm a Massachusetts employer, and an employee of mine comes to me and says, I've got this long planned vacation to San Francisco. It's a week-long vacation. I'm going. Person goes out to San Francisco, comes back. They're now subject to a mandatory 2-week quarantine, which, by the way, under the current leave laws, is federally protected because it's required by a government order. You've just turned a week vacation into 3 weeks out of the office. Now, there's a testing requirement, and my view is that you can compel people to take a test, but the time that they wait for the results is probably also protected, and we all know that may be a very long time. So the question I'm getting a lot in the last 10 days is, can an employer in Massachusetts tell employees they cannot go to a non-COVID safe state for vacation? The answer is, yes, they can. And because it's employment at will. But if you're a New York employer, you can't do that because there's a New York statute that prevents an employer from taking that kind of position. So all of this, right, is a lot of the legal landscape in which employers are making decisions is changing every day around this disease. The disease is everywhere, and we can try to keep ourselves safe, but we all know just from the numbers, it's kind of a losing battle. And a lot of what employers are doing about interior spaces is doing everything they can to protect their community, but it may just be that until there's a vaccine, the very act of being together is so risky that people are going to continue to choose not to do it. In the first 10 minutes of this conversation, I got an alert on my phone that Harvard has just decided not to bring anybody back for the rest of the year. My guess, Jim and James and John, is that when you're talking about Labor Day, I think January 1st is going to become the next Labor Day, or January 3rd, in terms of when employers target a more full return. And who knows if we'll be able to get there.
Yeah. Well, what do you do though, Josh, when, I mean, now it's easy because there's really nobody back in the office, but certainly I've heard of situations where staff, you know, is coming back in, and those are the folks that have to sit out on the floor, don't have private offices. They may be behind plexiglass that's been put up to protect them, but it's a lot different once you get in your office and then you realize I have to wear this mask now for 8 hours. You know, it's like when you go in.
And there are employees who say that wearing the mask for 8 hours interferes with their ability to breathe. Other people, right there, and that may or may not mean that if they have an underlying breathing condition, they may be entitled to an accommodation. Employers, if we're talking about people in cubicle spaces, one of the things that employers are starting to think about is, can I repurpose conference rooms? You can buy now these sort of plastic door things that the description of this is going to sound more dramatic than the reality of it, but it just is like a big plastic sheet that you can pull down in front of a cubicle and create a door and a more enclosed space. But the truth is that I think that most of us like not wearing masks more than we like wearing them. And I think for employees who are in vulnerable spaces but are told to wear masks 8 hours a day, you're going to see some non-compliance, and that non-compliance creates risk. And the thing that go back to why you have to change your view about work, the risk that you're creating is not just you may get sick, but we wear a mask to protect other people. And you're endangering the community that you work in, and none of us want, right? No employer wants an outbreak in their workplace. I've had clients, you know, just as there are ranges of people, there are ranges of clients. I've had clients who sort of very comfortably have said, you know, we've only had a few cases and only had one death. And then I've got other clients whose, you know, reaction to that is, I guess that's kind of the it is what it is approach to employerdom, which is more governmental than it is real. And then on the other end, you've got, I don't want anybody to get sick. How on earth what can I do to make sure that no one gets ill? The answer is, you can't do that, right? There's a space between where we're just trying to get as safe as we can. One last thing about offices too is, if you're in the position of making decisions about who can and can't come into an office building, how much responsibility do you want to take on? For the most part, I think landlords are saying, we want employees to follow their own human resources guidelines and then doing what they can around temperatures and elevator spacing and so forth. But there are a whole bunch of challenges once we get more full population in terms of how we're going to get people from the lobby to where they work and how we're going to get them down from where they work. You know, we have in our building 2 staircases. We've created a one-way up staircase and a one-way down staircase in order to try to minimize the times that people walk past each other. There's just a lot of puzzles here that aren't easily solved until we have the vaccine.
So James, hearing that, I mean, do you anticipate that you're going to hear from some of your tenants that they want to reposition their space, that instead of, you know, I know at Goulston we have large areas where people can congregate together to collaborate, and where maybe some secretarial stations used to be. Do you anticipate having to reposition your space?
I think tenants will do what they need to do, to Josh's point, as dictated by their human resources department, first and foremost by the government, the state, and the CDC, as to what they're required to do for their employee population. So I think that I don't anticipate that over the interim, the near term, call it the next 6 to 12 months, that we're going to see a bunch of our clients reconfiguring their spaces to, you know, go to from an open floor plan to a office type, more traditional, you know, offices with doors. First and foremost, there's a cost associated with doing that, right? So these are leases that are in effect. You have to spend money to reconfigure space. And I think with open floor plans, are there going to be, you know, challenges that are innate to that sort of layout? Absolutely. Just ask WeWork, right? In terms of how they utilize their space. I think that, you know, the reality of a WeWork is the majority, 80% of their desks are secluded through a door. And it's really the issue with their program, to me, is the fact that they have shared amenities. And how you deal with the food or the common areas in a WeWork where it's about a population, it's about a culture. And how do you keep people separated in that type of environment is going to be, you know, an interesting challenge, and I think that's where you're going to see some impact in terms of how, you know, companies utilize their space. So short answer, Jim, is in the interim, no, there's too much money associated with doing reconfiguring, and with common areas and cube farms or shared workspace, you can socially distance, and you're limited in terms of your population. And if you've got a group of, you know, 6 people that share a cube area, you can only have 2 to maybe 3 people in that cube area wearing masks at a given time, with plexiglass dividers that provide additional comfort regarding, you know, any sort of, you know, spread of germs. And that's what you're going to have to see.
Yeah, and the other thing around that is that this shared amenities piece is really complicated, because most offices, even, you know, the WeWork space, you've got the shared coffee machine or the shared refrigerator, and managing flow in and out of there is one thing, but the other piece is you have the surfaces. So a lot of it, people, I mean, I don't know, Jim, whether your package contained this, but this is a device that's designed to let me press buttons on the coffee machine. It has a little hook to open doors with. That's this kind of space that we started thinking about. And just
we gave
that
out, you know, the human stylist or whatever
right.
it is. I threw mine out immediately because I figured if I'm touching that thing and it's touching every surface, what's the difference between that and my finger?
I know. And do you rub hand sanitizer on this thing? I don't know. I don't know what the answer.
That's something I can't do.
Every once in a while, I think it's worth just sort of taking a deep breath and thinking about how weird, I mean, how much different the space we're in now in August is than the space we were in February. We have all been asked to think differently about things that we have taken for granted for our whole lives. It's a while. I mean, it's an emotional challenge.
It's hard. I mean, look, you used a perfect example. I mean, even the lawyers at Goulston and Storrs don't know how to read English on the back of a door to put from occupied to vacant.
No, I went into. I'm going to tell one more bathroom story, but I'll be careful about it. I went to a bathroom, and on the way out in a public space, there's a sign, and the sign said, "Did you spend 20 full seconds washing your hands?" And I read the sign and thought, you know, no, I didn't. It's just, it's a lot of different stuff that we're working through as people.
Right. Do you see, James, with any folks, you know, trying to keep their workforce, you know, to encourage them to come in? Do you see them going more to a hub and spoke approach? I mean, you're sort of well situated in that you have properties in both the urban and the suburban setting, but you know, for New York City, is that going to be an approach?
I think it's a great question, Jim. You know, there's so much media coverage regarding office and the things that are going to affect the office business, and there's a lot of, quite frankly, some of them pundits and some of them well-respected business people that have been, I think, somewhat irresponsible in terms of the narrative regarding the space, how they use it, work from home, hub and spoke, suburban versus urban. I think that the short answer is it's way too early to tell what the ultimate impacts of COVID-19 are going to be on the future of office. I'm in the office business. Boston Properties is in the office business. I will give you a long and well-thought speech about how office is not dead and the rumors of my demise are widely overblown, and that, you know, that ultimately human beings want to identify with culture and being social, and whether it's personal or professional environments, we want to be together and we don't want to be separate. And there's been some, I think, positives in terms of the remote environment, in terms of working. And I think that, and Josh touched on this, I think that there is, previous to COVID, a stigma associated with work from home that I think it's become very clear, having been through 2 earnings processes now, been through, a bond transaction and other financings and investor meetings and capital raising and treasury function and audit and, financial reporting and filing for, several months now, 2 quarter closes. It's been proven that people can do this. They can work this way and work this way efficiently. But if you ask everyone, do they want to continue to work this way? You're going to get some people that say, I love working from home, and I would prefer not to go into the office. But I think the vast majority of people feel differently about that. Getting back to the hub and spoke, again, I think it's too early. I think we've seen a lot of, corporates move back office space to the suburbs. And I think that we're seeing, particularly in Boston and places like Princeton, New Jersey, you've been seeing movements that have been driven by life sciences and technology into, the suburbs where, there's available space, because quite frankly, you can't lease space in a place like Cambridge, Massachusetts, whether it's office or life sciences today, because there's nothing available, right? And it's a better cost structure to be located in a suburban environment. Ultimately, companies want to be where the talent is, and they want to make it easy for their employees to get to work. And that's in a pre-COVID environment and more normalized environment, or in a COVID environment. And I think that the reality of how companies recruit talent, they want to be located next to the universities, and they want to be located to where their employees live. And if their employees are, moving to the suburbs and all the talent is there, then it would not surprise me in the slightest if there's a driver for companies to locate offices in suburban environments that are closer to their employee base, if there was a flight out of, the urban core out into the suburbs. I just don't think that that's going to happen, but it's certainly something that we all need to be mindful of as we move into the next phase of normal post-vaccine, where we can really see what the effects of this pandemic are on how people think about utilizing office space. I hate to use the example, and we talked about this on another call, but 9/11 was a very impactful situation on the office business. And post 9/11, there was many people that were saying nobody wants to be in the city ever, right? And that obviously didn't happen. It didn't stick. But there are many things that are a byproduct of 9/11 in terms of security and access to office buildings that have changed forever. And I don't envision that those things are going to revert back to pre-9/11. So I do think that there are things that are being adopted due to COVID that are here to stay. And it's just, whether or not suburban versus urban is one of them, I'm skeptical, honestly. But I think that there are some things that are going to change the way we utilize configured space. I mean, one positive, I would argue, is we've gone through this period, and law firms have been the biggest guilty party in terms of densification, right? Going from your traditional office size or square foot per employee of 400, 450 square feet down to 150 square foot per employee. Do I think densification is dead? I think the nail is in that coffin. I don't think that and that could honestly be a driver for companies, law firms or otherwise, to need more office space, because they need to spread out, because they've densified to a point where it's not sustainable in the current psyche, and maybe that psyche that impact on the employee's psyche about being close is never going to change. I want space. And so I would suggest that could be a positive long-term for the office business.
It's so interesting because it's from my perspective, that last piece is that the only thing I'm confident will carry over is the discomfort around proximity. I don't know what's going to happen to handshakes. I don't know what's going to happen to the hug greeting with people you don't really know, but I think we are all going to leave this experience more aware of one another as a vector for disease than we entered it. Part one. The second thing, though, is to the extent you can glean anything from the kinds of questions you get asked by clients when you do what I do for a living, and it's not a good way to prognosticate, but I'll just tell you, the work from home thing is real here. A lot of folks have tried to avoid giving people the opportunity to work from home because of the argument that it can't work. I think that's going to disappear. But I don't have clients who are busy thinking, do I want to be remote forever? What they're really thinking is they've gone from March, when it was, will there be a light switch in 2 months that says we can all come back in, to now, how do we make this work for as long as we have to make it work? But there's still that piece, right? We have to make it work, which is, I think, an express acknowledgement that none of us want to stay this way. So we're going to come back to something. And candidly, you know, I've got clients who are who are currently having meetings in outdoor spaces in people's backyards because the absence of meetings is so difficult for them. Not because they need them, but because we need the thing that Jim was talking about, which is we need to be near each other. It's in who we are. And I think that ultimately means back to work in a way that feels different, but more like what was before than what is now by a lot.
But will it change people's thinking on picking locations? So, you know, where we were before March is you wanted to have your office building right near public transportation so people could get in and be right near a transportation hub. Will it now turn the focus back more towards, is there ample parking? So for those folks that want to drive in, you know, and not be pushed in, and who knows, it'll depend upon the volume of people coming back and if you can stagger work times. No one, I don't see people being comfortable being jammed into a subway.
There's a fascinating, and this is the place where, right, everybody knows I'm not a doctor. I don't play one on television, but I've spent so much time reading so many things about the disease to try to advise people that I know just enough to be dangerous. But there's a really interesting article in the Times a couple days ago about the New York subway system, suggesting that we may actually have public transportation wrong, right? We're all, for the reasons that we were just talking about, which is the fear of proximity, we all reacted immediately with public transportation is a disaster. But when they look at even when they look at New York City, it's not at all clear that the subway system was a real vector. And it is clear that in cities like Tokyo with universal face coverings, that the number of instances of transmission on public transportation are actually really quite few, if any. And part of the reason for that is they're a little more conscious of spacing. But remember that there are two factors in exposure. One is there have to be droplets in the air, and the second is time. And for the most part, people take public transportation for relatively short periods of time. So it may turn out at the end of this that with a little more space and everyone wearing masks, we should be less worried about the subway than we'd worry about an hour and a half commute in a car with somebody who wasn't wearing a mask who we didn't know. Which you should worry about anyway, by the way. You shouldn't commute with people you don't know.
Right. So what do you do, Josh, is now from the employment side, if you have people in who aren't following, you know, we all know how important the masks are, but, you know, as I notice in my neighborhood, if I'm out for a walk, there are less people wearing them now.
Yeah.
Or as you're approaching. What do you do in an office building? Or James, you can answer this as well. Somebody downstairs wants to enter the building and they don't have a mask, or you have an employee who take the mask off and just says, I'm not going to wear it? Can you send them home? Or
Yes.
what do you do?
So this is where I remember the background principle in Massachusetts is employment at will, which means that if it's not discriminatory, you can fire anybody at any time for any reason or for no reason. Same with discipline. And I think that the standard that people should be using is you want to appear to have been too conservative, right? You'd rather have people say 6 months from now, in a world where no one got sick, boy, you know, we could have had 2 people in the bathroom at the same time. You didn't know what you were doing. Then have it turn out the other way. I think you've got to take firm action when people won't comply with the standards. And I think you have to be clear about having done it, because nothing works better to deter people than knowing that you're serious about something. And by the way, in a lot of businesses, right, different people get treated differently because of how they produce. I don't care who the person is, and it's easy for me as an outside lawyer, right? But I don't care who the person is who's not complying. You need to take action. And last point, and then maybe James will have some thoughts. I think it is incredibly important for the leaders of organizations to model the behavior that the organization needs to keep people safe. And I also think that in remote work environments, and this is business advice, not really law advice, you can't over communicate now. People, all of us working remotely, if you go back to James's point about the need to be together, people feel separate. Anything that leadership can do to maintain glue and to make employees feel connected to their enterprise as they're working from whatever room they're in is vital, I think, to the long-term success of the institution.
Yeah, Josh, what I would add, just to add to what you were just referencing, you know, we as an office company and our employee base, we need to be responsible and we need to lead by example. So to your question, Jim, regarding, you know, what happens if somebody's not wearing a mask, that shouldn't happen within our culture. That's not something, you know, we provide, and human resources provides all of the guidelines for the employee base to adhere to for those folks that are coming into the office or not. I think that there will be, because of human nature, and I've seen it myself in the lobby, you know, with our tenants that are being told to adhere to the policies, wear a mask. I'm not wearing a mask. Sir, put your mask on. And there are belligerent discussions happening on a daily basis because some people just refuse. So those are the unfortunate byproducts, and hopefully those examples are few and not frequent. But human nature is such that we're seeing some of that today. And, you know, unfortunately, then it's the challenge is then faced by our security staff that's in the lobby and how they need to deal with it. And then you guys can talk more in detail about the legal ramifications of what those discussions can entail, where, you know, the employee of, or the contracted employee of Boston Properties is prohibiting somebody from entering a building because they're not wearing their mask, right? So that stuff does happen. It's not frequent, but those are challenges of this current environment.
Interesting. What have you seen as far as the impact, just now turning more a little look at financing? You know, you must have leases that are coming up for renewal. Also, what are your collections looking like? You know, how's it all shaking out from a finance perspective?
Well, from a financing perspective, you can ask John Roach, because that's his bailiwick. As far as our collections are concerned, you know, it's really, we and most of their office companies have done really well in terms of office collections. You know, our collections rates through COVID have not eroded; they've actually improved in the office space, and they're above 98% overall. And in normal times, they're about the same level. So we have not seen any erosion in the office space in terms of our rent collection. Retail is a completely different story, you know, and it's less than 10% of the company, but, you know, retail collections have been anemic, 50% at best. And the only reason why we're actually collecting, some more material rents from some retailers is that are national chains that are well capitalized, or people like Apple, for example, who one would argue they're a manufacturing company versus a retail company. And they are, they pay their rent. So we have some of those tenants throughout the portfolio, but from a collections perspective, it's really been a tale of office versus retail. And then our one hotel, which we only have one, it's the Cambridge Marriott. And that hotel is largely driven by the business traffic across the river, associated with all the activity in Kendall Square. And honestly, that hotel has been closed. It's been closed for several months, and we don't anticipate that it's going to open anytime too soon. So those are the two real pockets. And then the parking, which is, we've got a number of garages throughout the portfolio nationally that are just not at a level where they're generating the same level of revenue that they had pre-COVID. So those are the areas of exposure. In terms of leases, Jim, we don't have a lot of rollover right now. So we're not in the throes of needing to deal with office leases that are coming up to their expiries. But for those leases that we do have where tenants were planning to leave the portfolio, go to another building, their spaces aren't ready. So we're doing a number of short-term extensions because construction, has ceased on the build out of their spaces due to COVID. It's been delayed by several months. So we're doing short-term extensions with tenants that may have, made the decision to either leave the portfolio or, to the extent that their lease is up for expiration, and hadn't yet made a decision, we're basically kicking the can and helping a number of those tenants out in that manner. But we're not really seeing much in terms of, other than the retail where we've done 160 lease modifications across the company, in terms of abatements, forgiveness, or changing to percentage rent deals. And we basically did that initially in April with the mindset that this was, we'll think about it as a 3-month event. Right. And so now all of those deals are now coming up again, and none of the retailers are at a level where we would hope they would have been at this point. So we're going to end up doing another series of lease modifications across the retail space, which is going to impact what we're going to be doing from a legal perspective from a lease documentation standpoint going into the 3rd and 4th quarters.
Okay, thanks. We actually just got a question in from someone. Want to know, and maybe Josh, you can speak to this, whether we've seen this at all, whether there's been any legal ramifications at all for owners, landlords, or tenants. Somebody, maybe objecting to the way the building's being set up, or.
So first, there have been some claims. I can't remember which law firm it is, sued under force majeure.
Simpson Thatcher. Yeah.
And I think you'll see more lawsuits like that. Nobody's won yet, but you're going to see claims along those lines. And there are also a couple of claims against employers for COVID exposure floating out in the courts. You're going to see those claims. The employment claim that is most viable, and that I think, and that I've already seen a couple of, are the following. Right, a lot of employers furloughed piles of folks when this happened, and have started calling people back, and there are a bunch of discrimination claims based on who's being called back and who's not being called back. So the message from an employment perspective is, as you repopulate, you need to apply the same kind of discrimination testing to your repopulation decisions you would apply to a layoff decision, to avoid the possibility of claims that are brought by folks who are not part of the repopulation, that the reason they're not part of it is because of their age, their gender, their race, or so forth and so forth.
Okay, great. John?
Yeah, maybe one other question. Some of the questions that have come in, we've already kind of talked about with mass transit and demand for suburban space. But, James, maybe on the leases that you are seeing in terms of lease renewals, are you seeing shorter term leases, just in terms of tenants, wanting to maybe do a shorter term deal just to kind of get through the other side of this before they make a long-term commitment.
We're seeing that in terms of those tenants that have near-term lease expirations. But we're not seeing any movement towards doing shorter-term deals today because we don't really know how to evaluate our space needs post-COVID. We're not seeing that at this point. Quite frankly, we're doing a number of very large institutional leases across our portfolio, particularly in Reston, Virginia, with folks like Microsoft that are long-term commitments for significant amounts of square footage. So we are doing a number of deals like that in the, I would call them the technology hotspots of our portfolio, one being Reston, Virginia, another one being Waltham, Massachusetts. The markets that are, I guess, more sensitive right now to what's gone on, you just have to follow what's going on in terms of the sublease space. So both in, I would suggest in San Francisco predominantly, where technology has been a huge driver of what's gone on out in Northern California, you're seeing a number of, I guess, pockets of sublease or sublease opportunities that are starting to rear their head and that are indicative of, I wouldn't suggest that it's necessarily tied just to COVID, but maybe tied more to the more fundamental impact of the pandemic on real estate, which is a recession. And in a recessionary environment, what happens? Companies contract, people lose their jobs, unfortunately, and there's less demand for space, and we see increases in vacancy, and we see erosion in rents. So I think that from my perspective, being in the office business, my biggest concern as it relates to COVID is not the virus, it's the recession that we're in and the impacts that that recession are going to have on the real estate business over the medium and longer term, depending on how long this environment that we're in is sustained. So the longer this goes on, the more we see in terms of unemployment, and the more we see in terms of distress in the broader economy, the deeper the impacts will be on the real estate business. And I'm hopeful that a vaccine is here sooner rather than later, and because I do think that science is going to provide, and maybe I'm putting all my eggs in one basket, but hopefully provide a higher degree of comfort level with how people feel about their financial condition and employment, and the economy gets started sooner rather than later.
Okay. I guess just a question with that in mind, are you folks looking at this as a time of opportunities, maybe to pick up properties that are now going to be undervalued?
It's a great question, Jim. And again, the short answer is yes, absolutely. Coming out of the financial crisis in 2008, that was a period of time when this company, as well as many others, were opportunistic in terms of growing their portfolios, looking for, pockets of distress or situations that require, companies like ours, which are well capitalized and well structured, have good balance sheets, and can raise the necessary capital to be acquisitive. I mean, during that period of time post the financial crisis, we bought the GM building, for example. We bought, 3 other assets from Harry Macklowe in Manhattan. We bought the John Hancock Tower. We bought Butt Bacon. I can't call it that anymore because it's not the name of the building, but we bought, a very iconic Boston skyline, Back Bay skyline asset. We bought Bay Colony. So there's a number of things that we did post the financial crisis because our financial condition, balance sheet, to be acquisitive. And we are extremely well positioned with, almost $3.5 billion in liquidity. And I'm sorry for doing the commercial, but we're in a very good position to be acquisitive. The unfortunate part for us is, the equity markets for REITs, is terrible. So that's not it's available to us if we want to use it, but I would suggest that $86 a share or whatever we are right now, that's not really going to happen. So we're in active discussions with a number of private equity, institutional private equity investors, and we're prepared to, be positioned to switch to offense versus COVID defense, and are really trying to be very strategic about our, opportunities. But that is really a fundamental core of this company's business, is being opportunistic based on where we are in economic cycles. And in times of distress, because of our access to capital and because of our relationships, we expect that we will be able to do more, which is a good thing for us in terms of growing this business.
Thanks, James. We got one other question here. I think we touched on it a little bit earlier, but in terms of, we were at 400 to 450 square feet per employee, and then we go down to 150 square feet. Do you have a sense of where, if you had to peg, post-COVID, where that shakes out? Is it 300 square feet, 350?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
All I can tell you is it's going to be more. I'm a firm believer that shared, workspace is going to be a really tough sell for employers to their employees. Yeah. So I do think that more offices and being able to spread out are going to be fundamental benefits to office landlords who have space, and will be able to, leases are not going to shrink as a result. The headwind for that is the remote piece of it. And is there some sort of, what is the impact of remote work on the office business? Do we need as many people in the office? It's kind of, you can't say that you can have hot desks, because then you're defeating the purpose of having your exclusive space, right? So I'm less in the camp of, I think remote work is going to have a contracting impact, and more in the camp of people are going to want to be spread out, and they're going to need more space versus less, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think whenever we talk about it, I think, to your point, I think the hoteling concept is likely to be out of favor, right? Even post-vaccine. So, if you have an employee that was in the office 5 days a week, and they're now coming to their manager and saying, look, the work from home worked well for me. I don't necessarily want to be home every day. I'm going to work from home 2 days a week and be in the office 3 days a week. That the office need, or the square footage for that employee, doesn't change. Right? Unlikely to change, right? So
Exactly.
They're not going to share that office with somebody else. So hopefully a benefit for Boston Properties going forward post.
The one thing I'd say about that, because I heard that in a lot of conversations as opposed to advice concepts, well, now I'll just go in 3 days a week, or now I'll just go in a couple days a week. I think once it's safe to go back, we're all underestimating the employer resistance to the idea that a hybrid environment is going to be as effective as an in-person environment. I really do think people are going to revert to their sense of what works very, very quickly, in part because, any enterprise that relies on generational succession relies on training. And whatever else you think about working from home, there's no question the opportunities to train more junior employees are really adversely affected by this environment.
Great.
Yeah, I think that's right. So in terms of the questions that we had, I think we covered all the questions that we got through the registration process. Jim, did you have any other questions that came up?
No, I think we covered them during either the presentation or the follow-up.
Yeah,
I don't see any others that are been queued up.
good.
So.
Well, so I want to thank Jim, James, and Josh. Really appreciate it. This was a very informative discussion. I also want to thank Sherry Stollison from the Berman Group, who puts all of this together effortlessly, and we couldn't do it without her. So appreciate everybody's time. I hope that everybody enjoyed the presentation, and enjoy the rest of your week. Stay safe out there.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.